This is a series on the book of Daniel. I've done chapter 1 and 2 and 3. Daniel chapter 4 is today's topic in the area of our examination. There is a second handout. Perhaps Adam could help with this. For those that have not been here or are kind of new to the area, visitors and such, there is a second handout. Now, this is not an outline. This is a list that encompasses the entire series. So if anybody wants another copy of that, they're welcome to that. That's to kind of help you with the historical context as the series unfolds. So I hope a lot of you already have that in your possession and will need it. But if you do see Adam, if you haven't been around at all on this series, you may want to raise your hand and Adam can help you out with that. So I'll get started here in just a moment as soon as everybody has an opportunity to get what paperwork might be useful to you. That really was very pretty, man. That was more, pardon me. That was that hard. Amen. That was very lovely. Yeah.
Amen.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's good to be in God's house today. I trust and pray that all are doing well. Today we're going to be moving into Daniel chapter number 4 is our study. Daniel chapter number 4. For those who are not familiar with this series, I suppose you can probably go over the CDs if you'd like. So far now, as we've gone through the book of Daniel, chapter number 1, we examined the historic context of the book of Daniel and the young man Daniel himself, and the tribulations he underwent personally, and the first great test he had. Daniel chapter number 2, we went into an examination of the famous story of the great statue in Daniel chapter 2 that King Nebuchadnezzar had, so we examined that. And last time we were together, we went through Daniel chapter 3. Now, Daniel chapter 3 is also a well-known story, of course. It's the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. And as we begin to look at chapter 4, we want to recap chapter 3 so that we can refresh our minds as to the general context of the situation. So as we review Daniel chapter 3, let's just look at the outline if you care to do so. Of course, you'll need your Bible open to the book of Daniel, chapter 4, where we're heading. But as we consider Daniel 3, we'll remind ourselves that chapter 3 was a response to the famous dream that Nebuchadnezzar had in chapter number 2. And Nebuchadnezzar's response was to erect his own statue, his own image, a golden image, because Nebuchadnezzar refused to consider that his kingdom would fall. That was something he did not want to do, and gold being representative of the Babylonian dynasty, and his dynasty in particular, his entire image was gold, of course, in Daniel chapter 3. So he created a golden statue to represent his kingdom, and he had devised a test of loyalty. A test of loyalty. Now, ostensibly, this was a religious test, but Nebuchadnezzar, not being a particularly religious man in general, he was concerned with the politics of the situation, and he created this test of loyalty to all the leaders in his kingdom. He asked them all to come, all the governors and the satraps and so forth and so on. He devised this test of loyalty. Well, as we learned, the 3 Hebrew young men were forced to disobey. They really had no choice. They were caught in this highly unpleasant situation. They could not honor the statue. They did their best to do so with dignity, however, and courage, and God rewarded that. But they were miraculously delivered. And the deliverance, though, as we saw, was more than just the deliverance of these 3 men, because in doing so, God was showing his favor for the purpose of preserving his people. It was not merely about the courage of these 3 young men. It was about God's favor toward his people, even though his people in the land of Babylon were under judgment, collective judgment. The Judean people that were there were under judgment of God. God, still in judgment, had not forgotten them. And he was very attentive, opening up opportunities for their preservation, to preserve his people. And so that was the story of Daniel chapter number 3. Now this takes us to chapter number 4. And as we kind of begin this, we're continuing to see the evolution of this great king, Nebuchadnezzar. So as we begin Daniel chapter 4, we're going to be reading the whole chapter. We're going to read it in chunks. We're going to go into the second famous dream that God put into Nebuchadnezzar's mind. Now bear in mind, we want to remember that Nebuchadnezzar was one of the greatest kings of the ancient world, one of the most powerful men in the ancient world, and probably the most, well, almost certainly the most powerful man on the planet at this particular moment in time. So he was, we've got to always bear that in mind. He was at the apex of his power. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, let's just begin reading as we look at this great dream, dream of the tree. Some of you will recall this. Let's begin by reading the first portion of this chapter. I'm going to read the first 18 verses, all right? So as I read, I'd encourage you all to follow along, and then we'll kind of work our way through the outline and see what we can glean and by having a series of questions. Are we ready? Daniel chapter 4, please get out your Bible. You don't have to turn back and forth all over the place. We're in one place only. Daniel 4, beginning of verse 1, here we go. Nebuchadnezzar the king, to all people, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied unto you. I thought it good to show the signs and wonders that the high God hath wrought toward me. How great are his signs, and how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation. I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at rest in mine house, and flourishing in my palace. I saw a dream which made me afraid, and the thoughts upon my bed and the visions of my head troubled me. Therefore I made a decree to bring in all the wise men of Babylon before me, that they might make known unto me the interpretation of the dream. Then came in the magicians, the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. And I told the dream before them, but they did not make known unto me the interpretation thereof. But at the last Daniel came in before me, whose name was Belteshazzar, according to the name of my God, and in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And before him I told the dream, saying, O Belteshazzar, master of the magicians, because I know the spirit of the holy gods is in thee, and no secret troubleth thee. Tell me the visions of my dream that I have seen, and the interpretation thereof. Thus were the visions of mine head in my bed. I saw, and behold, a tree in the midst of the earth, and the height was great. The tree grew and was strong, and the height thereof reached unto the heaven, and the sight thereof to the end of all the earth. The leaves thereof were fair, and the fruit thereof much, and in it there was meat for all. The beasts of the field had shadow under it, and the fowls of the heaven dwelt in the boughs thereof, and all flesh was fed of it. I saw in the visions of my head, and upon my bed, and behold, a watcher and an holy one came down from heaven. He cried aloud and said thus, Hew down the tree, cut off his branches, shake off his leaves, and scatter his fruit. Let the beasts get away from under it, and the fowls from his branches. Nevertheless, leave the stump of his roots in the earth, even with a band of iron and brass, in the tender grass of the field, and let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portion be with the beasts in the grass of the earth. Let his heart be changed from man's, and let a beast's heart be given unto him, and let 7 times pass over him. This matter is by the decree of the watchers, and the demand by the word of the holy ones, for the intent that the living may know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whom he will, and setteth up over it the basest of men. This dream I, King Nebuchadnezzar, have seen. Now thou, O Belteshazzar, declare the interpretation thereof. For as much as all the wise men of my kingdom are not able to make known unto me the interpretation, but thou art able, the spirit of the holy gods is in thee. All right. Thank you. Now let's look at some baseline points here. And by a series of questions on the outline, we're going to just try to see what we can glean from this, and I'll give you my perspective. All right, first of all, the first question to be posed, at this point in time, this great king, this king that clearly God was working and accomplishing certain things through him. No question about that. What was this king's spiritual condition? What was Nebuchadnezzar's spiritual condition? Well, I'm going to say that at best, he was still a polytheist. Now, you might look at the first verse or two of this passage we read, and he recognized that there is a great God out there. He was at a point where he was willing to acknowledge that Jehovah must be divine. But he was not at a point where he was willing to recognize that Jehovah was the only God that existed. You'll note that in verse 8 and verse 18, he refers to Daniel as a man who has the spirit of the holy gods, plural, he believes is in Daniel. And he even refers to Daniel back in verse number 8, he refers to Daniel by the name Belteshazzar, which was his own personal favorite deity. So Nebuchadnezzar still had a particular favorite deity. Yet when we look at the man's life as a whole, he certainly wasn't really a spiritual man. I've sort of, in my studies of Nebuchadnezzar, concluded that he was something like what we might today call an agnostic, a man who was interested in power, in wealth, in concrete things of this world, willing to acknowledge that there may be something up there in the divine world. Certainly that was important in his particular culture, because his culture was not an atheistic culture. They were very much concerned with their false pagan gods of the Babylonian system. But, I don't think that was a high-profile aspect of Nebuchadnezzar's life. It was something that he had to interact with in his own culture and society. So if we say that he believed in something divine, I believe he may have, that God was pushing him, Jehovah was pushing him in this direction, of course. But I leave it, at this point in time, he'd gone no further, in my view, than perhaps being a polytheist. But nonetheless, what is really overwhelmingly interesting to me, and as I go through the book of Daniel, is how God was working through this great heathen man.
Amen. Amen.
That's really rather remarkable. It's not what we would necessarily expect. The next question could be posed. Why in this dream was it a tree? Why was the tree really symbolic? Why was the dream about a tree? Well, it's because the tree represented the power of life. And this is something that I think is more unique to that Mideastern culture. Bear in mind, in the Mideast, and in those days like today, the Mideast is not, and this is where his empire spread, throughout the middle portion of the Middle East and many of the countries around Iran, all that sort of thing, Syria, Jordan, etc. That land is not a great forested part of the world. It was arid then, as it is now. And for desert people, more than people like us that live in Missouri, a tree was a very valuable thing. A highly valuable thing. Because trees obviously have, from the wood and the fruit and the shade and all the very wonderful things that we get from trees, we take them for granted because they sprout up everywhere. In fact, we try to chop them down and get rid of them. And there's too many trees growing in my meadow. For them, it was very much the opposite. For them, a tree was a highly valuable thing. They obviously are only going to grow in places where there's a pretty large amount of water. So they grow along river banks, or stream banks, or in higher elevations where there's extra snow and rain in the mountains and things of this nature. So for them, when they saw a tree was this incredible power of life in a world that had a lot of lifeless regions. There was lots of sand and dry plateaus and rocky, barren areas. A tree represented life, represented tremendous power, the power of life. And you can see that as it describes in verse 12 this tree, how it produced much fruit, and there was shade, and all the earth was sheltered under this great tree. So it represented power. It gives us an impression and an image of the extent of Nebuchadnezzar's power throughout the entire civilized world. Now, the next question, and this is an easy one for some of you, what is a watcher? Yes. What do they watch? Well, a watcher is simply an angel. These are angels who witness men's lives. And I just might remind you of that point. the angels, the watchers, as they're sometimes referred to, they do know and see what we're doing. You might have wondered, what would it be like to be an angel? Angels have their own challenges, their own tests. And we know from Scripture that 1/3 of them have really dropped the ball. But for those that have been faithful and loyal, they have their own tests, their own challenges, their own set of duties. Amen. But they have the particular privilege of watching our lives unfold. Amen. And that's why there's places in the Bible that talks about the angels may be rejoicing when they witness a sinner come to repentance or something of this nature. The angels are watching. As imagine yourself, if you're a nanny and you're in charge of a little flock of 5-year-olds. And you're watching over their lives. You're hoping that they will not fall off the monkey bars. And you're hoping that one won't poke the other in the eye. And so forth and so on. The angels are watching and hoping. And here they are in over our lives. Why was the tree, moving along, why was the tree cut down? But notice it was more than just cut down. If you look at verse 14, it says it was cut down, hew down the tree, cut off the branches, shake off the leaves, scatter the fruit. The tree was cut down and basically chopped up. Cut down and chopped up. The whole tree was not just cut and left. The whole tree was just totally chopped to pieces. Well, no. We're able to perceive, and I think the people who heard this dream perceived this actually rather quickly. This dream represented the king. It was to show the utter helplessness of the king as we understand how the dream unfolds. When we see later on that this tree represents the great king, it shows that he was utterly helpless. Utterly helpless. To show the king's utter helplessness. Now that leads us to another interesting question. Why was the stump left? Why, in this dream, was the stump not ripped out? Well, I believe it was meant to show that not only did the life of the tree remain, and ancients understood this as well as you and I. The stump is still there. In many cases, a tree will grow back. But it's to show that the life that remained was very humiliated. It was a humiliated life that remained. Nothing but a stump. Nothing but a stump. We'll come back to that stump later here in a little bit. Of course, verse 16 is interesting. This dream says that a beast's heart be given to him. A beast's heart be given to him. Let 7 times pass over him. Let his heart be changed from man's, and let a beast's heart be given to him. And as we look on further, we finally get to the end, and it describes his life as a beast. We understand it really is this is an animal beast. So we won't go into the whole issue of the beast and beast of the field and these kinds of issues. I believe this is a beast that was an animal. It describes him as having hair like his hair grew long like an eagle and claws. So he's eating grass like an ox and so forth. So this was an animal's heart. We would call an animal. Now, the word heart is interesting because that gives us insight. Now, in the ancient world, the word heart meant a little bit something different to you and I. It really wasn't until, I believe, the 1600s when a gentleman named Vesalius in England. No, I've got that wrong. I'll just say this. Harvey it was. It wasn't until the 1600s that Harvey discovered and proved that the heart is what pumps the blood around your body. Now, before the 1600s, people had some understanding of the human body. They knew that if you cut yourself and all the blood drains away, you die. I mean, that's been known since the beginning. And they know certain other things. You cut somebody's head off, they die. They knew that the heart was whatever that thing inside you that was thumping away, that they could perceive that that's an important thing, whatever it is, whatever it does. But the word heart didn't necessarily refer in ancient times to the organ that would be associated with. The heart referred really more to the organ that we would describe as the thinking part of you. Yes. All right? So today, we understand the thinking part apparently is inside our skull. At least that's where most of our thinking occurs. Sometimes you kind of wonder when you bump into certain people if they're using their brain or not. But they're thinking with their belly or some other part of their body. But nonetheless, we understand, okay, the thinking occurs in the brain, it's in the head. Well, people didn't understand that. They knew there was something up there. And they knew that probably important things happened there as well, but they didn't really understand it. So the word heart in Scripture and the word heart in literature and in ancient times, and even up through the medieval period, just meant the thinking part of you. Yes. The thinking part of you. So when it says a beast's heart was given to him, it's saying that he's going to lose his understanding. His knowledge, his understanding. And we can perceive when we go to the end of the story that this makes perfect sense. He was essentially going to lose his rational functions. The difference between, the most obvious differences anyway, between that of an ox or a bird or whatever it is, and human beings, that we have rational functions. And presumably kings have a lot of rational functions, and Nebuchadnezzar had proven himself already to be a man of great intellect and energy. He was going to lose all that. So when it says a beast's heart was going to be given to him, he's going to lose his rational function. A lot of people like to simply use the word insanity. He became insane. So a beast's heart is insanity, insane. He loses his rational function. Now, an interesting question could be posed regarding the astrologers, back in verse 7. It says, why did his astrologers not tell him the interpretation? You might think that the astrologers didn't tell him because they didn't know what it meant. Now, that might have been true back in Daniel chapter 2 with the dream regarding the statue with the 4 different pieces. That was really very, there's a lot of, that took a lot of insight to figure out that particular statue, that particular dream. This dream really isn't all that complicated. I mean, it doesn't take a lot to say, gee, could the dream represent, the king? And the tree, if the tree gets cut down and the king represents the tree, that's bad news for the king. It's bad. This isn't particularly, in my view, a dream that is difficult to interpret. Right. You might notice that it doesn't say that the astrologers didn't know the interpretation. It tells us they didn't tell him the interpretation. And when Nebuchadnezzar first received the dream, you'll note in the first portion of this chapter, it tells us that he was afraid. Yes. I'm guessing that Nebuchadnezzar already had an idea of what this dream meant. Yeah. He already had a hunch that he was the tree, and it being cut down was bad news, and he was hoping to check with his soothsayers and astrologers because he was frightened, and he was hoping maybe they'd come up with something else, which they didn't. And so they didn't tell him. They didn't tell him the interpretation. Perhaps they said, we don't know. It doesn't really tell. It just says they didn't tell him. Perhaps they let him think they didn't know. So he has to be thinking these astrologers and soothsayers are totally worthless, but that's another story. Meanwhile, so they didn't know. I believe it's because they were afraid. I think they probably had a pretty good idea, but they were afraid. Now, why would they be afraid? Bear in mind, you got to keep going back to the ancient world and what ancient world governments were like, and even in the medieval world with great and powerful kings ruling with real power, unlike the king and queen of England who really is a figurehead. It is typically forbidden either by law or by habit to predict something bad happening to the reigning monarch of your nation. You can't make a bad prediction about them. It was forbidden. Henry VIII had that. It was forbidden by law in Henry VIII's reign when he was ill. And all of you heard of Henry VIII, right? The guy with 6 wives. Yeah. Forbidden by law for his doctors who were trying to help him when he was very, very sick. It was forbidden for them to have a diagnosis that might say you have a mortal illness. They could not give that diagnosis. Any diagnosis but that would be fine. Well, he already knew he was bad sick. All right. Same thing is generally true. The soothsayers, it was very, very dangerous business. They exceedingly dangerous political business here to suggest or hint, let alone say outright to his face, "O king, this particular situation means you're going to die or something terrible is going to happen to you." That was considered treason. Yeah. So it's not surprising that the soothsayers and astrologers were afraid to tell the interpretation. All right, so let's move on. Let's read the next little section of verses, and we'll see what else we can glean. Let's move on to the story. We'll start at verse 19 now. Excuse me. So I'll read for you. Return to your Bible. I hope you've got your Bible open. Let's read from verse 19. We'll run on down to 27. Are you ready? Follow along with me, please. We're going to pick up the story here now in verse 19. Then Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, was astonished for 1 hour, and his thoughts troubled him. The king spake and said, "Belteshazzar, let not the dream or the interpretation thereof trouble thee." Belteshazzar answered and said, "My lord, the dream be to them that hate thee, and the interpretation thereof to thine enemies. The tree that thou sawest, which grew and was strong, whose height reached into heaven, and the sight thereof of all the earth, whose leaves were fair, and the fruit thereof much, and in it was meat for all, under which the beasts of the field dwelt, and upon whose branches the fowls of the heaven had their habitation. It is thou, O king, that art grown and become strong. For thy greatness is grown and reacheth unto heaven, and thy dominion to the end of the earth." Whereas the king saw a watcher and a holy one coming down from heaven, and saying, "Hew the tree down and destroy it, yet leave the stump of the roots thereof in the earth, even with the band of iron and brass, and the tender grass of the field. Let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portion be with the beasts of the field, till 7 times pass over him." This is the interpretation, O king, and this is the decree of the Most High, which has come upon my lord the king. That they shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and they shall make thee to eat grass as oxen. And they shall wet thee with the dew of heaven, and 7 times shall pass over thee, till thou know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. Whereas they commanded to leave the stump of the tree roots, thy kingdom shall be sure unto thee, and after that thou shalt have known that the heavens do rule. Wherefore, O king, let my counsel be acceptable unto thee, and break off thy sins by righteousness, and thine iniquities by showing mercy to the poor, if it may be a lengthening of thy tranquility. So here's Daniel's interpretation. First question. Why did the meaning trouble Daniel? It says he was troubled for 1 hour. And he finally only gave the interpretation to the king when the king said, "Daniel, don't worry, just tell me the truth. Tell me, don't worry. You're not going to get in trouble, Daniel. Don't let it bother you. Don't let it trouble, just tell me." Well, I believe Daniel was afraid for 2 reasons. First reason he was afraid, he was fearful to tell the king the real meaning of the dream, was for the same reason as the other astrologers and soothsayers. He did not want to bring this extremely bad news to this very, very powerful man. He knew this was not what the king really wanted to hear, yet the king cajoled it out of him after several reassurances that it'd be all right to tell him what he thought the real meaning was. And it probably wasn't a great surprise to Nebuchadnezzar, in my humble opinion. But there's a second reason. Now, I'm going to kind of hold back on that second reason. Daniel was troubled and worried and filled with anxiety and fear, I believe, for a second reason. A second reason. A more personal reason. Something that was connected to him in a more personal way. But we'll kind of hold off on that, right? So you just put that in the back of your mind, what that second reason might be. Second question, when we think about the interpretation. What was the main lesson that was to be learned from this? Well, this is not all that mysterious. Verse 27 is really a revealing statement. Focus your mind on verse 27. There's really 2 wonderful thoughts found in verse 27. The first one, well, maybe this isn't so wonderful, but it's certainly important. God notices sin.
Yes.
God notices sin. Nebuchadnezzar was not aware of that. He didn't really acknowledge. It's not, I guess, not overly surprising that he might think that his shortcomings as an emperor, as a king, as the ruler of the greatest empire on the planet, as a ruler of most of the known civilized world, he didn't really have any regard for anything that might be up there in the heavens. He thought that sin was something, well, that's for little people to be concerned with, not me. That's for others to be concerned with. I don't need to worry about that sort of thing. But God notices sin. God notices sin. And that takes us to this next point, which is somewhat a happy thought. Could this judgment have been avoided? Well, I think verse 27 tells us that apparently, at least in my view, the answer may have been yes. This judgment might have been avoided. Daniel boldly exhorts and encourages the king to break off his sins and iniquities. Not only is Daniel bold enough to tell the king the real meaning of the dream, he's bold enough to tell the king that he is a sinner, that he is accountable to a greater authority in the heavens, and something very bad is going to happen to him if he doesn't change his ways, and he better be about it pretty quick. So look at verse 27. Daniel says, "Wherefore, O king, let my counsel be acceptable unto thee, and break off thy sins by righteousness, and thine iniquities by showing mercy to the poor, if it may be a lengthening of thy tranquility." Now, has there ever been in Scripture a time in which God says a judgment is coming, and yet the Bible indicates that that judgment might be avoided if there is repentance?
Yes.
There are. There are a number of illustrations in the Old Testament where we find that God declares as a coming judgment, but yet, even after He makes the declaration, He opens up a window of opportunity for repentance. And there's a few that we can think of that come to mind in which this actually happened, in which God said there's going to be a judgment. Ahab is one example. The old wicked king Ahab of Israel. His time is gone now. He's dead and gone. There was a point in Ahab's life where God said, "I'm going to judge the house of Ahab. I'm going to do it pronto." And Ahab said, "Ooh, I guess I better straighten up." And he did. And God kicked the judgment way down the road. Maybe if Ahab had kept on track, he might have avoided it indefinitely. So God is really a lot more merciful in many respects than we sometimes believe. Or maybe I should put it this way. God doesn't enjoy the judgment that He is compelled by His own honor to deliver to us. He's not doing it because He loves to, like a bully in a schoolyard. He enjoys seeing the pain in others. He likes to pull the tail off the lizard, like a 10-year-old little boy might do. That's not God's way. It's not God's manner. All right. Let's continue. Let's look at the fulfillment now and the consequences of this fulfillment as we make our way back through the chapter. So probably the main lesson to be learned is that God notices sin. Judgment very well might have been avoided, but most of you know how the story goes. It wasn't. So let's continue. We'll pick it up at, let's see here. Let's read 28. We'll pick it up at verse 28 and I'll read on down to 33. Are you ready? Let's look at the fulfillment of this and the consequences that flow out of the fulfillment. Immediate consequences. All this came upon the king Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of 12 months, he walked in the palace of the kingdom of Babylon. The king spake and said, "Is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by the might of my power and for the honor of my majesty?" While the word was in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven saying, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to thee it is spoken, the kingdom is departed from thee. And they shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. And they shall make thee eat grass as oxen, and 7 times shall pass over thee until thou know the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whosoever he will. The same hour was the thing fulfilled upon Nebuchadnezzar, and he was driven from men, and did eat grass as oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hairs were grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like birds' claws. Well, there's a mental picture for you, right? Apparently living outdoors, eating grass. I don't really understand how all that works, because, grass doesn't keep a person alive. We don't have the right enzymes in our stomach to actually live off grass. We'll starve to death. May have a clean colon, but you'll starve to death. So maybe the word grass just meant vegetables, and maybe he was, picking berries or whatever. I don't know. But we're kind of getting sidetracked here. But you get the mental picture. He's living outdoors, he's wet, his hair is long and scraggly, and so whoever was supposed to try to watch over this guy and cut his hair wasn't able to do it. His nails got long, and he's probably, maybe, who knows, digging around in the dirt for roots. We don't really know all the details, but you get this mental picture of someone who is a rational person, not just rational, brilliant, conqueror of the world, is now reduced to grubbing in the dirt and living under shrubs and bushes and wet from the rain and the dew. And he looks like a complete wreck. That's Nebuchadnezzar. For 7 times, apparently, probably 7 years. Very elongated period of time. Well, now, wow, what a mental picture. You really think about it. Well, let's look at the fulfillment of this and the consequences. All right, so we see we'll just use the word insane. He's gone insane. He's lost his marbles. He's nuts. Crazy. First question. Let's go back to that stump. We learned back in verse 15 that there was a band of metal placed on the stump, and it's mentioned again in verse 23. Iron and brass. Now the phrase is iron, the use of the word iron and brass had a strong connotation in ancient world that's a little different from us perhaps. But brass and iron were the 2 primary metals of the ancient world that were used to forge powerful tools. The brass, the bronze and brass age was coming to an end. The iron age was beginning about this period in history. And so it represents power and strength and something heavy. And we noticed that on this stump, there was placed some iron and brass cap, a band, something was on it. And that cap or that band was placed on the stump to keep that stump from doing something, to prevent that stump from flourishing again. It was as if whoever was responsible for the tree going down, or maybe not, we don't really know, but somebody, somehow, whether it was divine providence, there's something being placed on this stump so it can't quickly and easily grow back. This iron band of metal. Why was this band of metal placed on the stump? Well, we've got to understand that when a king goes down in this nature, somebody takes his place. You don't ever have a lack of potential somebodies who would say, "Oh, I'll take over." Has that ever happened in history when there's a ruler? I mean, imagine if you have the president is unavailable. Is it the sort of job where there's nobody who say, "Oh, nobody wants the job"? No, it doesn't happen, does it? In fact, there's always powerful and ambitious men who are eager to take on that task. Despite the fact it may be dangerous and difficult, and they know that, they're very willing because of the lust and desire and the lure of power. Great power. Great power. So he had his enemies. We know he had his enemies. Daniel said in his interpretation, the interpretation of this particular dream is going to be benefiting somebody, and who is it? It's his enemies. Oh, he had enemies, believe you me. So the band of brass is to represent the harshness of the rule of those who took his place. Now, usually in royal governments, they would call such a person a regent. A regent is a temporary king, a substitute king. He's ruling in place of the king because the king can't rule for whatever reason. So you have a regent. Now, the rule of the regents was harsh, firm. And they were wanting to maintain their power in place. They enjoyed that power, and they did not want Nebuchadnezzar to recover. This band of metal was on the stump to show the harshness of the regents. We can easily see and answer the next question. Who would benefit from this power vacuum? Well, it was clearly those who hated the king. Those who hated the king. It tells us back in verse 19, the dream be to them that hate thee. Those who hated the king were going to prosper. You might think, oh, that must be like conquered nations. No. That's not the correct understanding here. The people that hated the king were others who wanted to take his place. Kings always have competitors. They're not that far away. Amen. Sometimes even his own kinfolk. Yep. Hate them. And wish to take their place. Now, in the case of this, it doesn't identify who these people were, but you can be absolutely confident that there were those who hated the king, who wished to take his place, and this was their opportunity, and indeed, I am convinced that this is what they did. They took this opportunity, and they ruled in the place of the king. And they ruled with harshness, and they were going to change a few policies that they didn't like. Now remember, there are those who are jealous of the king's attentions. Now recall from chapters 2 and chapters 3 that some of these foreign peoples that had been conquered, namely the Hebrews, had been brought in and had been elevated to lofty places. And you can bet there were Babylonians who hated this. They did not like it. In fact, go to the last verse of the previous chapter. You'll discover that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, after their close call in the fiery furnace, were promoted even higher and loftier. And you better believe that the others who were watching didn't care for that. Now that's going to tell us what Daniel was afraid of. The second reason why Daniel was afraid. The first reason he was afraid to tell the king the correct interpretation is he thought, well, it might make the king angry at me. It might harm me. It might chop my head. Doesn't like bad news. Been known to happen before. But that wasn't the only reason Daniel was afraid. Daniel understood something. He understood that this king had been a patron and protector of a special group of people, and it was the Hebrews. And he knew that if this king was out of power, those who hated the king and hated the people that the king had elevated would be coming after them. Daniel knew that this interpretation was not only bad news for Nebuchadnezzar, it was bad news for the Hebrews. It was bad news for his people. It was bad news for the Judeans. So we can answer the next question. Besides the king, would anyone else suffer during the 7 times? Presumably 7 years. Would anyone else suffer? Well, most people would suffer. In fact, the kingdom was probably likely to suffer greatly in many, many ways. The entire empire was likely to be thrown into a certain amount of tumult. But especially those who the king protected, the Judeans. Those the king protected. And he protected the Judeans because he had been so impressed by Daniel and by the 3 young men, his 3 companions, that he had given special religious privileges to them and had elevated them in his empire to very high positions of power. And the native Babylonians did not like this. And so he knew and understood that this was a danger to them. Now, allow me to take a few moments to digress. As we turn our outline over, a question could be posed. And this will, I think, might help edify your understanding of what was happening then. Are there other examples of anything like this in history? And the answer is yes, there actually are many examples. In the course of hundreds and hundreds of years, there are many examples of a powerful ruling monarch going crazy.
Yeah.
It's not terribly uncommon. I'll give you three well-known examples. And for those of you who enjoy history, this is your moment. And for those of you who find it dull, tune back in here in a couple minutes. I digress now. One example, an interesting example, is the Roman Emperor Caligula, who I believe lived around 40 AD approximately. I need to double check that. But Caligula, his name actually means little boots, and that's sort of a nickname. That's another story. Caligula was the Roman emperor. He had come to be the emperor, I believe, after Tiberius. Tiberius being an elderly man, passed on to Caligula, who was his nephew, I think. And he didn't really have any great heirs, so Caligula, as a young man, becomes the emperor of the entire Roman Empire, 40 AD. Now, Caligula was a spoiled and worthless fellow in many respects. But he was the only, kind of the last family member standing practically, so he becomes emperor of the entire Roman Empire. And by this time, the Roman Empire was being ruled, its government was essentially hinged on one man. The old Roman Senate and all that was pretty much merely forms that didn't matter. So all this power is thrust in the hands of Caligula. So he rules rather poorly for several years. Very poorly. Accumulates quite a few personal enemies. The people that guard him don't particularly respect him. People are generally afraid of him. It's just one of those rulers that you just like to say, I just want to get away from him if I possibly can.
Amen.
And then he got sick. Sick for several weeks. Everybody thought he was going to die. But he didn't. Everyone was disappointed. He recovered. The bad news was he was even worse. When he recovered, he really lost his mental faculties, and he tipped over the balance into what you would call true insanity and paranoia. And began to come up with all kinds of willy-nilly things about executing folks for no reason whatsoever, left and right, and imagining all kinds of conspiracies against him, which were totally ridiculous. And other odd, strange things that just was creating enemies just ever faster. One of which was to erect for himself an enormous statue of himself, which he intended to place in the Holy of Holies in the city of Jerusalem, to show those Hebrew Judeans that he was as great as Jehovah. This was all unfolding just a few years after Jesus had been resurrected and taken up to heaven. That didn't happen. Caligula was killed by his own guards. They finally had enough. The bodyguards killed him. Well, that saved the skins of a lot of folks. But the Roman Empire was really being rocked by this very, very poor leadership. Let me use a second quick example. Some of you have heard of the 100 Years' War. 100 Years' War was a war between England and France that lasted a little over a century. One of the kings during the 100 Years' War was the French King Charles VI. Charles VI he reigned for over 40 years. Unfortunately, he kept on living and living and living, and he had major periods and episodes when he was totally insane. Totally lost it in just complete irrationality. There are occasions, well, the most famous story of when he was of his insanity, during one elongated episode, he thought he was made of glass. And he wouldn't let anyone touch him lest he break. But there are other episodes. During different episodes, he attacked his own men. He thought some of his own bodyguards were actually Englishmen, and so he killed them, pulled out a sword, and killed his own bodyguards. There's all kinds of crazy things happening. Meanwhile, the French, because they were being led by this king who was insane, the government of France fell into utter and total ruin. And of course, the English were winning the war because the French had no leadership. Conversely, 30 years later, guess what happened? The English got a taste of the same thing, It's a long story why, but it turns out the English had their own crazy king, Henry VI. And Henry VI didn't really go crazy in the same way. He just went into a trance, sort of a semi-comatose manner. He didn't really go unconscious, but he would just sit and lie and just stare into space for weeks and weeks and weeks. He couldn't eat. They thought he died, but just before he would starve to death, and they kind of poke a little food and water in, he'd wake up again. So they had their own trouble. Well, it turns out he was the grandson of Charles VI, which is a different story. But now that was the period for the English. Now, while Henry VI was reigning, the same war was going on, and that was the period when the French had gotten rid of their crazy king and got a better one, and the English now were losing the war. And in the end, the English lost. The point I'm making, there are many illustrations in history of this sort of thing happen, actually. Quite a few. Those are some of the notorious ones. And it's always very, very bad for an empire, for a kingdom, for a nation to have this happen. And so imagine the chaos that ensued inside the government of this absolutist empire that ruled the planet when their king was out trying to eat grass and berries and living outdoors under a little shrub. Who would rule? And how would they rule? Well, it was utter chaos. It's safe to say that there was a lot of chaos behind the scenes. It was safe to say that those who were the enemies of the king had the upper hand. Daniel says so. And they were able to impose their own harshness in areas that the king was not. They had hoped the king would never recover, so they capped off this stump. You have this metaphorical stump that's capped with an iron band. So, what did this mean for the nations in history where this occurs? Well, in each case, it's a catastrophe. Utter catastrophe. We want to return to our outline. Now, let's read quickly the last few verses of this chapter. Let's go to the end of the story here, because it does end better than where we're at. Are we ready? Returning to Daniel 4, verse 34. Let's continue. And at the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted up mine eyes unto heaven, and my understanding returned unto me, and I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him that liveth forever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. And all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. And he doeth according to his will the army of heaven, and among the inhabitants of the earth. And none can stay his hand, or say unto him, What doest thou? At the same time my reason returned unto me, and for the glory of my kingdom mine honor and brightness returned unto me. And my counselors and my lords sought unto me, and I was established in my kingdom, and excellent majesty was added unto me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all whose works are truth, and his ways judgment, and those that walk in pride he is able to abase. Well, there's a happy ending, at least from Nebuchadnezzar's point of view. You could ask, now what was his new religious perspective? Let's look at that. As we consider Nebuchadnezzar at the end of his life, most scholars agree that this is toward the end of Nebuchadnezzar's long reign that this particular event occurred. There's been some time lag over